I was scrolling through my feed the other day when someone asked me something that made me pause. They wanted to know about the flood of explicit content everywhere we look now, how it might be rewiring our brains, and whether genuine human connection is becoming a casualty of this digital age. It's one of those questions that sounds simple on the surface, but opens up into something much more complex when you really dig into it. Let me walk you through my thoughts on this, because honestly, it's something I think about a lot. When we talk about the saturation of sexual content online, we're not just discussing traditional material anymore. We're talking about something that's evolved into this whole ecosystem of implicit and explicit messaging that surrounds us constantly. Think about platforms where people stream in hot tubs or wear revealing outfits while playing games, necessarily crossing into fully explicit territory. But the suggestive nature is unmistakable. We're being bombarded with sexual stimuli from every direction, and the natural question becomes, what does this constant exposure actually do to our minds and our relationships? The honest answer is that nobody really knows for certain, but I have strong suspicions that the effects aren't entirely positive. To understand why, we need to look at how human beings evolved and how our brains developed to respond to certain stimuli. Our brains didn't evolve in a world of infinite abundance and instant gratification. They evolved in environments where resources were scarce and survival was challenging. This shaped the way we respond to things like food, companionship, and reproduction. Take food as an example because it's actually a really useful parallel to what's happening with sexual content. Our ancestors lived in a world where calories were hard to come by. Finding energy, dense food meant survival. Brains evolved to make us feel incredible pleasure when we consumed things that were high in sugar and fat. This wasn't a flaw in our design. It was a feature that kept us alive. When you stumbled upon honey or fatty meat, your brain rewarded you with intense pleasure to make sure you'd remember that experience and seek it out again. This made perfect sense in a world of scarcity. But then something changed. We developed agriculture, then food production, industrial food manufacturing. Suddenly, we could create foods that were specifically engineered to hijack those ancient pleasure circuits. We made foods sweeter than any fruit that ever grew naturally, fattier than any meat our ancestors could have hunted. We call these foods delicious, and we crave them intensely, even though they're now killing us through obesity and diabetes and heart disease. The evolutionary advantage became an evolutionary liability once the environment changed. Entire industries have grown around exploiting this mismatch between our ancient brains and our modern environment. Fast food chains, manufacturers, soft drink companies, they've all figured out exactly how to push our buttons. They're not necessarily evil. Many of them would argue they're just giving people what they want, just making pizza or burgers or whatever. There are legitimate arguments about personal freedom and choice. But the reality is these industries have adapted to fit the existing architecture of our brains, and they're making enormous profits by exploiting vulnerabilities that evolution created. Genuinely believe we're seeing the exact same pattern play out with internet content, dopamine, triggering media, and sexuality. The last major revolution that exploited our evolutionary wiring was probably the food industry. Now we're in the middle of a cognitive revolution that's doing something similar, but in the realm of attention, emotion, and desire of the people creating this content are absolutely trying to be predatory about it. You've got executives sitting in boardrooms literally strategizing about how to extract maximum engagement and money from users. They're thinking about conversion rates and retention metrics and lifetime value, treating human psychology like a resource to be mined. It's not all cynical manipulation. Some content creators are just trying to make something they'd want to experience themselves. Game developers who want to build the most engaging game possible, artists who want to create something beautiful, entertainers who want to make people laugh. Their intentions might be pure, but the end result can still be something that hooks into our brain's reward systems in ways that become problematic. Both the cynical exploitation and the genuine creativity can end up producing content that preys on our evolutionary circuitry. This is exactly what's happening with sexual content across the internet. People are figuring out, sometimes through deliberate strategy and sometimes through trial and error, what kinds of images and videos and interactions get the most engagement. Look at photo sharing platforms and how people curate their images. They're not neuroscientists, but they're running informal experiments every single day. Someone posts a picture and it gets moderate engagement. Then they post something wearing less clothing and suddenly the response explodes. Then they push it further and maybe they go too far and people think they've crossed a line. So the engagement drops. They learn to calibrate exactly where that sweet spot is, the amount of suggestiveness that maximizes attention without triggering negative reactions. They're essentially mapping the contours of human desire through this Darwinian process of content selection. What gets likes and shares and comments survives and gets repeated. What doesn't get forgotten. Over time, the entire ecosystem evolves toward increasingly effective stimulation of our attraction and arousal circuits. I saw recently that Norway passed legislation requiring people to disclose when their photos have been edited, which is fascinating because it acknowledges that this whole system has created a distorted reality that's affecting how people see themselves and others. The consequences of all this are starting to become visible, even if we don't fully understand them yet. We're definitely seeing addiction patterns emerge. Research shows that the likelihood of developing compulsive behaviors around explicit content correlates strongly with how early someone was exposed to it and how intense that initial exposure was. Your brain encounters these supernormal stimuli during its formative years. It can literally wire itself around those experiences. We're seeing genuine psychiatric consequences from this. We're also seeing confusion around intimacy and what normal sexual experiences actually look like. A lot of people who grow up consuming this content develop expectations that don't match reality, and this creates all sorts of problems when they try to have actual relationships with actual human beings. I remember working with someone once who told me they couldn't reach completion when they were alone. As we talked more, I realized they actually were reaching that point, but they didn't recognize it as such. They had this idea that the experience should involve a massive, explosive physical response, the kind of thing you'd see in videos. When I asked them to describe what actually happened, they explained that they'd get some physical release, but not what they called the full version. It took me a while to understand what they meant. And then I realized they were comparing themselves to what they'd seen in videos where the physical response is exaggerated and often artificially enhanced for visual effect. After our conversation, I actually went and looked up medical literature on what normal human physiology looks like in terms of volume and response, because I wanted to understand exactly how far their expectations had drifted from reality. This person had been comparing themselves to a fantasy version of sexuality and concluding that something was broken in their own body. They genuinely believed they were somehow defective because they didn't match what they'd seen on screens. That's just one example of unexpected consequences that we couldn't have predicted. You can't forecast that widespread consumption of explicit videos will lead to young people becoming confused about whether their own bodies are functioning normally. That's not the kind of effect you can model or anticipate, but it's absolutely real. We're also seeing patterns where people develop very specific physical requirements for arousal, where their brains become so conditioned to certain types of stimulation that more typical experiences don't work anymore. It takes time and effort to rewire those neural pathways back to something that aligns better with actual human interaction. Are we being affected by all this? Absolutely yes. But here's the problem with trying to study these effects scientifically. Landscape is evolving so rapidly that research can't keep pace. By the time you design a study, get funding, collect data, analyze results, and publish findings, the entire environment has transformed. 5 years ago, subscription platforms where people pay for personalized content from specific creators didn't exist, or at least weren't mainstream. Now they're a massive industry, and I'm certain that the parasocial elements of these platforms are creating intimacy issues in real relationships, but we won't have solid research on that for years. Think about it from the perspective of someone in a relationship. For a long time, partners have worried about their significant other consuming explicit content, feeling like it represented a kind of infidelity or comparison that threatened the relationship. Those concerns have existed for decades. These new platforms add a whole additional layer of emotional connection and interaction. It's not just watching strangers in videos anymore. It's forming ongoing relationships with specific people, having conversations, making requests, feeling like you have a special connection with someone. The parasocial nature of it means that people develop feelings of intimacy and relationship with creators, even though it's fundamentally a commercial transaction. This is going to intensify all those concerns that partners already had. Some people will be fine with it. Relationship structures are diversifying, more open relationships and different approaches to monogamy becoming more accepted. Maybe for many people, this won't be a problem at all. I suspect for others, it's going to create serious conflicts. And the reason these platforms are successful in the first place, because they've identified something that previous forms of explicit content were missing. They've recognized that there's a psychological dimension that's even more powerful than the purely visual aspect. It started with printed images, which offered zero interaction, then video, which was more immersive, but still completely one-directional. These platforms figured out is that the fantasy becomes exponentially more compelling when there's an element of personal attention and interaction. If you're attracted to someone, being able to actually communicate with them, get their attention, feel like they know you exist, that activates completely different parts of your brain. We saw earlier today how people can develop compulsive behaviors around streaming platforms partly because of these parasocial dynamics. What effect is all this having? As a scientist, the most honest answer I can give is that I don't know, and nobody else does either. What we can say with confidence is that we're seeing clear signs that something fundamental is changing in our brains and in the way we relate to each other. Now, I don't want to be catastrophically pessimistic about this like some people are. You'll find people declaring that this is the end of all human relationships, that these platforms will destroy pair bonding completely, that we're headed for some kind of intimacy apocalypse. I don't think that's necessarily true. Part of why I do the work I do on streaming platforms is because I believe we can fight fire with fire. Yes, people can develop unhealthy patterns around these platforms. We can also use these same platforms to teach people about those patterns and how to develop healthier relationships. We can help people learn to communicate more effectively with their partners. This kind of education about relationships and communication hasn't been widely available for most of human history. It's possible that we can build and maintain healthy relationships despite all these challenges simply by becoming more knowledgeable about ourselves and how we function. I'm not saying we need to create some kind of wellness-focused version of these content platforms. That's definitely not what I'm suggesting at all. Maybe someday, but that's not the point I'm making here. What I am saying is that the world is changing in ways we don't fully understand yet. Is it causing problems? Almost certainly yes. Does that mean we should try to stop the world from changing? I don't think so. The entire trajectory of human civilization has been about creating new challenges for ourselves and then figuring out how to solve them. The Industrial Revolution happened and we started burning fossil fuels at an unprecedented rate. And now we're dealing with climate concerns. We have to develop solutions like reforestation projects and alternative energy sources. That's just how human progress works. We create problems, then we have to get creative about fixing them. We're experiencing a similar revolution in the cognitive realm right now. We're doing lots of things that offer short-term cognitive and emotional benefits, but may have long-term costs. There's almost a cognitive climate change happening alongside the environmental one. I think this is part of why we're seeing increases in mental illness, why depression and anxiety rates keep climbing, why in some demographics we're seeing concerning trends around self-harm and despair. These are symptoms of this broader cognitive transformation we're going through. Does explicit content play a role in that? Sure. Do subscription platforms contribute? Absolutely. Do video sharing sites and streaming platforms and social media all factor in? Of course they do. Are these things evil? Should we try to halt technological progress because it has downsides? I personally don't think that's the answer. I think we can learn about ourselves and develop strategies to manage these challenges. I love video games, for example, and I think they've enriched a lot of lives despite also having potential for overuse. Now, virtual reality develops truly convincing haptic feedback. That's when things get really interesting. I actually gave a presentation about this at a game developer conference a few years back. Biggest concern about the evolution of this industry is what happens when you can have fully immersive sensory experiences in virtual reality. At that point, you're no longer just watching or interacting at a distance. You're having experiences that your brain can't really distinguish from physical reality. Genuinely stop pursuing real relationships and reproduction. Add artificial intelligence into the mix where you could have a virtual partner with a sophisticated personality that responds to you, challenges you, even frustrates you in realistic ways, and you've created something that could fundamentally alter human social behavior. Imagine a virtual companion that's programmed to be exactly what you find most appealing, that learns your preferences and adapts to them, provides emotional connection and physical sensation indistinguishable from a real person without any of the complications and compromises that come with actual human relationships. That's not science fiction anymore. We're maybe a decade away from that being possible. And when that happens, I think we'll see a massive shift in how people choose to live their lives. Right now, there's often a social stigma around people who are deeply invested in virtual relationships or animated characters. People mock and denigrate those who develop strong attachments to fictional partners. But I think that's going to change. Attitudes toward gaming changed. Remember, when people who played video games seriously were considered social outcasts, when it was seen as something only lonely, maladjusted people did. That stigma has almost completely disappeared as games became more sophisticated and widespread. Once they got good enough, everyone started playing them. The same thing is going to happen with virtual relationships. Right now, the technology isn't quite there. People can dismiss those who are into it as weird or sad. But as the technology improves to the point where the experience becomes genuinely compelling, where it offers things that many people find preferable to the challenges of real relationships, I think we're going to see massive adoption. The virtual companion revolution is coming, and I don't think most people are prepared for how it's going to transform society. This all ties back to the original question about how the saturation of sexual content is affecting us. The fundamental issue is that we're experiencing a mismatch between our evolutionary programming and our technological environment. Our brains evolved to find certain stimuli incredibly compelling because responding to those stimuli helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. Being attracted to potential mates, forming pair bonds, desiring sexual contact, all of that was evolutionarily advantageous. But now we're in an environment where we can artificially create supernormal versions of those stimuli, intensified beyond anything that exists in nature. We created foods that are sweeter and fattier than anything our ancestors encountered. We've created sexual stimuli that are more intense and varied and accessible than anything evolution prepared us for. And just like with food, where our evolutionary drives now lead us toward obesity and disease, instead of survival, sexual drives in this new environment might lead us toward isolation and dysfunction instead of bonding and reproduction. The question is what we do about it. We can't uninvent this technology. We can't go back to a simpler time. That's never been how human civilization works. We only move forward dealing with the consequences of our innovations as we go. We have to get smarter about understanding ourselves. We need to recognize when our instincts are being exploited or leading us in unhealthy directions. We need to develop new skills for navigating relationships in this strange new world we've created. Communication becomes more important than ever. Understanding your own patterns and triggers becomes crucial. Being able to distinguish between what you genuinely want and what your primitive brain has been conditioned to crave becomes a survival skill. Learning to build and maintain intimacy with real people who have flaws and needs and their own agendas becomes more challenging, but also more valuable. I think about the person I mentioned earlier who didn't know their body was working normally because they'd been conditioned by artificial representations of sexuality. That kind of confusion is going to become more common, not less, as the technology gets better and the content becomes more pervasive. How many people are walking around right now with false ideas about what normal relationships look like, what normal attraction feels like, normal physical experiences should be? How many people are comparing themselves and their partners to fantasies and finding reality lacking? These aren't hypothetical concerns. They're playing out right now in millions of individual lives. People wondering why they don't feel satisfied with their partners when their partners are actually wonderful people. People struggling with desire and arousal because their brains have been wired to respond to levels of novelty and intensity that no real relationship can provide. People feeling inadequate because they're comparing themselves to carefully curated and edited representations that don't reflect reality. People choosing isolation and virtual experiences over the risk and vulnerability of genuine connection. At the same time, I don't want to romanticize the past or suggest that relationships were better before all this technology. They weren't. People have always struggled with intimacy. Relationships have always been complicated and often disappointing. The difference is that now we have new tools that can either help us understand ourselves better and build stronger connections that can lead us further away from genuine human contact into increasingly sophisticated artificial substitutes. Which direction we go depends on the choices we make both individually and collectively. The industries creating this content aren't going to voluntarily pull back. There's too much money involved, and from their perspective, they're just giving people what they want. Regulation might play some role. That Norwegian law about disclosing photo editing, but you can't really legislate away these deeper psychological dynamics. The solution has to come from individuals becoming more aware and making more conscious choices about what they consume and how they let it affect them. This means developing media literacy around sexual content the same way we've started to develop it around news and information. It means being able to recognize when you're being manipulated or when your responses are being artificially triggered. It means understanding that what you're seeing isn't real, isn't typical, isn't a standard you should measure yourself or others against. It means being honest with yourself about how your consumption patterns are affecting your real world relationships and your own well-being. It also means being able to have honest conversations with partners about this stuff, which many people find incredibly difficult. There's so much shame and insecurity wrapped up in sexuality that people often can't talk openly about what they're experiencing. But if you can't tell your partner that you've been consuming content that might be affecting your desire or creating unrealistic expectations, how are you supposed to work through those issues together? The silence around these topics often does more damage than the behaviors themselves. I think we're also going to need new social scripts for navigating all of this. What are the boundaries in a relationship around different types of content and interaction? Is it different if it's anonymous videos versus interactive platforms where you're forming ongoing connections with specific people? Is it different if money is involved? Is it different if there's communication happening? These aren't questions with universal answers. Different people and different relationships are going to draw those lines in different places. We need to be able to talk about them explicitly rather than just assuming everyone shares the same unstated assumptions. The younger generations growing up with all this as their normal are going to develop their own approaches to managing it. Won't have the same reference point of a world before this technology existed. For them, this will just be how things are. Might make them more resilient to it in some ways, since they won't be constantly comparing current conditions to some imagined better past. But it might also mean they're more vulnerable to having their development shaped by these forces without ever knowing an alternative. We're already seeing some of this with how young people approach relationships differently than previous generations. More casual attitudes toward commitment in some ways, but also more awareness of mental health and communication in others. More acceptance of diverse relationship structures and identities. More skepticism about traditional institutions like marriage. This is probably healthy adaptation to new realities. Might represent losses of valuable things that previous generations took for granted. It's probably a mix of both. The thing that concerns me most isn't any single effect or outcome. It's the speed and scale of the change. Beings are remarkably adaptable, but we adapt best when changes happen gradually enough that we can learn and adjust. When changes happen faster than we can process them, that's when you get social disruption and psychological casualties. Now, things are changing incredibly fast. The landscape of digital interaction and sexual content looks completely different than it did 5 years ago. 5 years from now, it will probably be transformed again in ways we can't predict. Every time we think we've figured out the implications of some new technology or platform, something else emerges that changes the equation entirely. The research is always years behind the reality. Wisdom and coping strategies are always lagging behind the problems. We're constantly trying to catch up, and we never quite do. That's an uncomfortable position to be in, especially when we're talking about something as fundamental to human experience as sexuality and relationships. But I keep coming back to this idea that human beings are problem solvers. We create challenges for ourselves, sometimes inadvertently, and then we rise to meet them. We've done this over and over throughout history with technology, social organization, resource management, everything. There's no reason to think we can't do it with this challenge too. It requires us to be thoughtful, self-aware, willing to learn and adapt. It requires us to extend compassion to others and ourselves as we navigate this strange new world. It requires us to maintain hope that we can build meaningful lives and relationships even in conditions that seem to work against those goals. Someone asks me whether the flood of sexual content everywhere is affecting us and whether genuine intimacy is suffering. Answer is complicated but ultimately hopeful. Yes, we're being affected in ways we don't fully understand yet. Yes, real challenges emerging around intimacy and connection. Yes, we're likely to see more problems before we figure out solutions. But no, I don't think this is the end of human relationships or the death of intimacy. I think it's a transformation, difficult and disorienting, one we can navigate if we're intentional about it. The technology isn't going away, and it's probably going to get more sophisticated and compelling. So we have to get more sophisticated too, more aware of ourselves, more skilled at creating and maintaining genuine connection in an environment full of artificial substitutes. That's the challenge in front of us, and it's one I believe we're capable of meeting.